Welcome to Access Ideas, where we share insights and perspectives that spark curiosity, conversation, and inspiration. I'm Yana, and in this special crossover episode, I'm the one in the hot seat as Chris Miller, host of the Talk to People podcast, interviews me. Get ready for a dynamic exchange as we dive into the world of captivating communication. We'll explore how to steer conversations, ask engaging questions, and master the art of dialogue. You'll hear us unpack what makes certain communicators truly magnetic and how small shifts in expression can amplify your message's impact. We'll tackle the balance between authenticity and polish, and even touch on how mindfulness can sharpen our communication skills. Whether you're looking to excel professionally or enrich personal relationships, you'll find practical wisdom to apply right away. For the full experience, catch the video version on our YouTube channel. You'll find the link in our show notes, along with Chris's podcast and other resources we mention. So let's dive in as Chris Miller turns the tables and interviews me on the art of communication.
All right, Yana, let's kick things off. Could you share me an instance or a turning point in your career that solidified your belief in the power of starting every conversation with curiosity?
Good question. I would say the more experience I have, the more I'm aware of what I don't know. And some people call that the Dunning-Kruger effect. So I would say definitely within, I would say 5 or 10 years of my career, I started noticing that there was a lot of opportunity for growth and learning, and you never know exactly who's going to teach you. There's an expression like, I've learned silence from people who don't listen. I've learned forgiveness from people who can't forgive. I've learned patience from people who can't wait. But I've never said thank you to any of those people because, of course, those experiences are frustrating. But curiosity is hard won in my case, because I think I learned that if you can tap into it sooner rather than later, you skip a lot of suffering and you have some fun. So it's kind of a win-win.
Yeah, skipping the suffering is a great point. I was on a call. I was like a sales call. I was trying to pitch someone for podcast production, a nonprofit. And I talked for like 20 minutes explaining everything. And then I was like, I started to read kind of what they wrote a bit more in depth. I was like, wait, you're not even wanting to start a podcast, are you? And they were like, no, we were just wondering like the certain thing. So now I've learned a big part of the sales process is discovery.
Yes.
Yeah. And going in there and trying to understand everything and then posing that question of, well, how can I help you? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And helping them reach their goals.
And that so many people don't actually know quite what they want. And so that discovery process can help you work it out together. And sometimes by the end, it might not be something you can help with, but by virtue of you helping that person by listening, they're going to remember you when they do need something that you can help them with. And that's the great part is, say, it sounds like maybe you actually need support for an ad campaign, or maybe you need some talking points for a meeting with a smaller group of people, whatever it may be. But ultimately, the fact that you help them clarify that, they will remember, and they're going to come back to you and say, hey, that's that helpful guy that helped me figure out how to communicate.
Yes. It's always good to be remembered as the helpful person. What was your inspiration and what made you start your podcast, Access Ideas?
I'd had a podcast called Audiobook Reviews in 5 Minutes, starting right around the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. And people had asked me to start a podcast. They'd said, you talk about some really interesting things. You sound interesting. Why don't you start a podcast? And the pandemic gave us the perfect chance because there wasn't much to do. So it was kind of a weekly opportunity to review great audiobooks and share some of my favorite insights or things that I found interesting. But I noticed over time, and you might be able to relate to this, Chris, I think you can, that the format was a bit constrained, that I was missing out on exploring other formats, other topics. And it was a little bit scripted. And I ultimately wanted more freedom to just try out new things. And eventually, the first few episodes were more of a monologue or me just sharing thoughts and ideas. But over time, I realized how much I loved talking to people and connecting. And there was this whole other element that I could find in conversation that just didn't exist on my own. And I think you know this more than anyone because, I mean, talking to people, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
What do you think of that idea? Like, do you notice that special energy that comes from the conversation exchange and the give and take?
For sure. I think that that's where magic is a lot of times. And I think my mom, one time I was riding with her back to Oklahoma and it was a sunny day. It was in the fall. So in Kansas, the leaves were changing colors. And she said that the sun really made the leaves look pretty, right? Like the leaves were like a cool color, but then whenever the sun hit them, it was like boom. And she made the analogy of like that's what people are like in our life. Whenever we talk to them and whenever we're around them, and they bring out that beautiful, vivid color in us. And I totally agree. I think that podcasting has been super fun, but I do get nervous before podcasts. Like before this one, despite knowing you, even before whenever I had my mom on, I was like, whenever you hit live and you hit record, there's some nerves there.
Well, if it makes you feel better, I feel the same way.
Yeah.
But I see it as almost like a sign of respect. Like the day that I don't feel that means maybe it's time to move on because I'm not
Mhm.
excited. Or at
Mhm.
least that's what I tell myself. I say I'm excited, but it's definitely a bit of a nerve
Yeah.
feeling, right? And I was thinking about that today and trying to figure out what it is because I thought, well, I'm not nervous that I'm going to say anything dumb. I mean, that's the magic of editing, but why do I feel kind of keyed up more than I would for another type of conversation? What do you think it is? Because I don't have the perfect answer, but I know the feeling.
I think it's one's because we're recording, two, because I know for me, whenever I am either doing my podcast or on other people's podcasts, I think about their creative investment in me and the risk they're taking. Because with either of our podcasts, we could have anybody on, maybe not anybody, but a lot of people on, right? And choosing that. So sometimes I get nervous about that. I also think that I can get nervous not just for you, but for anybody, knowing that there's going to be moments in this conversation where we don't know where to go next, and where we get to make that decision. Like we don't have a script that says every minute for minute mark,
Mm-hmm.
and that uncertainty definitely makes me nervous.
That's funny because I was just listening to your chat with another podcast guest. I think Jason Rates was his
Yeah.
name.
Hmm.
And I think maybe you asked what his theme song would be, like his walkout song. And then it made me think, what would my walkout song be? And for some reason, Let's Dance by David Bowie popped into my head
Mm.
because I feel like conversation is a dance. And to
Hmm.
your point, sometimes there's a bit of choreography. Sometimes you do have a few steps or a special move that you want to show. But a really good dance is about being in the moment. And that's like a really
Hmm.
good conversation. And yeah, there's a lot of spontaneity. There's always this element of risk. Like, what if we just go off onto this weird tangent and it's super boring? I don't think that's going to
Yeah.
happen, but it's a legitimate concern for some interactions where people do like more of that scripted approach.
Yeah. Whenever you're editing your podcasts, have you ever had a podcast where you wanted to erase a lot of it because you felt like it was boring?
Oh yes. Yes. And that, my talent is not editing. I'm trying to work on that. But I think there's a whole art to the content edit and picking out the insights that can turn a conversation that might have felt a little bit meandering a little bit low energy into something that people will sit up and listen to and
Hmm.
feel like they get something out of. So that's been probably one of the harder elements to draw on, and just to know at the end of a conversation, I have enough to work with versus I don't know what we're going to do.
Yeah.
So I think I'm better now. And if a conversation feels boring, I would always place the responsibility on myself. It's never the guest's fault, right?
Right.
It's up to me to keep things lively, engaging, have an exchange. And so maybe part of it comes with experience. How about you? What do you do when you feel you've come to the end of something that might be a bit of a sleepy, stroll?
Oh man. I will I I wonder how many times Annie has heard me say, I don't know if I'm gonna use that one.
Uh, oh no.
And typically it's her saying like, oh, I'm sure it was good. And then I'll go in and I'll edit it and I'm like, yeah, it wasn't terrible. But I am grateful that I talk about it because I want to avoid getting in the moment like right now, especially with the small podcast team. Like I do the editing and the recording, right? I feel like if the teams were separate, if I had a separate editor, then I may not be thinking like, oh, that was a good moment. Like, oh, she just nailed that. That's a good short. Or like, all right, when are you coming to a close? So I have to force myself to get out of there. And I also know that whenever I'm listening to podcasts, sometimes I like the authentic conversation, even when it's boring.
When it's kind of strained or it feels like they're trying to figure out what to say, because that's relatable up
Yes.
to a point. Well, you mentioned a moment ago, Chris, the whole idea of wondering when someone's going to wrap it up, so to speak.
Hmm.
What do you do when you've got someone who's on a roll and maybe they're starting to sound a bit rehearsed? Do you interrupt them? Do you try and sort of build a tangent to make it more engaging? Like, do you have a technique that you like?
Sometimes my technique is me saying to myself, I'm going to edit this out. But
That works.
yeah, but I have heard to ask a close-ended question and then when they stop and answer, then to quickly hop on and ask something else.
Mm,
So be like, you said that was an 1890, right? And they're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And you're like, oh, what? Blah, 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 blah. So close-ended questions, I think, are really good for ending conversations.
that's
And then I,
good.
I also think they're good for initiating conversations. Like I know that people say like open-ended conversations is really how you explore and get people out there. But if you approach a stranger and you're like, what's the meaning of life? It will be hard to get that ball rolling. But if you approach the stranger and you're like, hey, do you know where the library is? And they're like, yeah, over there. And like, oh, thank you. Like, I appreciate that. Are you a student around here? And like, da, da, da. Like starting with close-ended questions opens up the opportunity to then ask open-ended questions. So I think they get a lot of flack close-ended questions, like, but really they have a lot of utility.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I think I've got to remind myself of that because I focused so much on open-ended that
Hmm.
I think I've maybe neglected the power of the closed-ended, and that's useful.
Yeah, it is. And an open-ended question for you was, I know that we've already discovered or discussed that you have podcasts, and you have a big interest in communication. And did that choose you or did you choose it?
Ah, that is funny because I initially chose to go into fashion design after high
Mm,
school. I loved
mhm.
art, I loved design, loved making things, but I found it was not satisfying. I missed thinking and ideas and talking to people about those ideas. And I think in conjunction with that, I've always been fascinated by communication because my family, or some people in my family, I should say, in case anyone's listening, aren't really great communicators. Some people have really corrosive styles, shall we say. And I remember being a kid and like practicing responses for when someone would say something to me that didn't feel right. And so I already knew that communication was powerful and I knew that it could do amazing things. But I think that belief in the power of communication is what ultimately led me back to study English literature. And I think still at the very heart of me is this childish idea that communication, if you do it well, is like a magic spell that can change the world. But maybe all of us believe that on some level. And that's why we keep trying, because we don't really want to give up. And words are amazing when they work. So ultimately, that is in a nutshell how I got into it.
Have you seen any magicians with words? Are there people that you know, or moments in your life where you thought to yourself, wow, the way that they just put together those words manifested something that wouldn't have happened had they not done it in that way?
Absolutely. I would say a lot of comedians, like especially irreverent comedians like Ricky Gervais, a lot of British comedians for some reason. I love the British sense of humor, but my favorite podcaster is Sam Harris. And I remember listening to his podcast, must be over a decade ago. And he was really what inspired me. He was the person who
Wow.
inspired me to start podcasting, because I thought if I could speak so well and articulate ideas as clearly as he could, surely I'd be bringing something good into the world. And I also I use his meditation app. And what I love is that he's not afraid to elevate other people. And I've been introduced to so many powerful thinkers and speakers and communicators. And that's the key, is to be listening for good speakers, people who can present their ideas in a compelling way. And that's not to say that you have to be the world's most articulate person. You don't have to be the most well-read or academic by any means, but its style, its substance, its tone. How about you?
Mhm.
Who's inspired you?
I remember I saw this one speaker. He was a pastor at this church in like Washington. And I was sitting there listening to him. And he did this thing where he was speaking, he had a lesson, he had all these different, like, beautiful, essentially parables, but it was stories and the imagery. And then at the end, he started singing into the mic and he had a beautiful voice.
Wow.
And I was like, this is not fair. His voice was so good. And I remember thinking to myself, whoa, that was incredible. And it made me want to become a better speaker, because it's fascinating, right? We have, I don't know how many words there is in the English language, but we have all of these different words and we can pick and choose them. Something like my master's was, a big part of it was presidential rhetoric. So looking at, in particular, farewell addresses. So how presidents say goodbye. And one thing that was really fascinating, I did from Jimmy Carter all the way up to Obama. So Trump was in office whenever I was like graduating. So it was like, I didn't do Trump's. But one of the things that was really fascinating about Donald Trump was whenever he did his inauguration address, the range of words he used like of the different words, he used less words,
Mm-hmm.
and they were very simple words.
More one-syllable words.
Yeah. And it was really fascinating too, because other, like Obama used like a high variety of words, and then the words were like, the readability score was higher, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm,
But Trump
definitely.
had the lowest readability score. And it's fascinating because he was also, I'm going on a tangent here, but
That's okay.
actually, I'll finish this one just by saying he was still an effective speaker despite having low variability in his words.
Yeah.
So we all have like the same amount of words, but it just depends on how we structure them and order them, and then how we
Yeah.
deliver them. Like you said, substance, style.
Well,
Um,
Something you just mentioned about Trump
Yeah.
made me think about my curiosity around hypnotherapy and hypnosis, because his
Mm.
style of speaking is similar to some hypnotists. Like, he will
Oh, wow.
repeat certain words and phrases, and sometimes just in a different order. It's like, it's tremendous. It's very tremendous. And that is a very deliberate tactic that resonates with people. Repetition, I mean, that's one of the most classic rhetorical devices. But I always wondered, did he take hypnosis
Right.
lessons? Because there is this sort of hypnotic quality that if you just study and listen, I think he's captured this cadence that mesmerizes certain people. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail commenting on politics, but
Right.
actually that is one of the reasons I enjoy your YouTube videos, communication
Mhm.
expert analysis. You're not judging the person on the merits of their politics. You're
Right.
looking at the actual strategy, the tactics, and how effective it is, and what impression we're left with. So I find that endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, me too. And it was one of my favorite things because I would talk to people about, for instance, in Oklahoma, whenever I came home from grad school, I'd be like, oh my gosh, Obama is such a good speaker. And they'd be like, what are you saying? Get out of here. Right. And then there was all these articles saying that he used a teleprompter in an elementary kids, like a schoolroom, whenever he was
Hmm,
giving an address. And
interesting.
there's a picture of him with these third graders, and they're sitting crisscross, and he's talking to them, the teachers, the staff, all these people, and he has a teleprompter. And a lot of people were very critical of him because they were essentially saying everything was scripted and he couldn't do anything off the cuff. But it does make you realize that when you get to certain areas in life or levels of an organizational structure, it could be government or business, or there's so much scrutiny on every word you say and how you say it. And I think he and his speechwriters, I don't know, maybe there was something going on, but they're like, hey, stick to the script. But he did do a little improv. But I love that idea of, I'm not going to look at content. And it's almost like it's a good thing for me. It helps me with my content creation because I could just watch something and be like, okay, here's what stuck out to me. Here's what stuck out to me. And people will comment on the video and be like, so you didn't break down what the Nord Stream pipeline was for Russia? I'm like, no, I didn't, but I'm not going to.
That observation about Obama is interesting. It makes me wonder also, he was trying to be a role model for kids there. And so maybe seeing somebody that was more eloquent and articulate was
Mm-hmm.
part of his brand, so to speak. And maybe this goes back to that age-old argument of authenticity versus practice. And, if you're someone that just shows up and speaks off the cuff, are you being natural and authentic, and therefore people trust you? And that tends to be where people are right now. And I think that's people who like Trump will often say, who he is, what he's all about. He doesn't
Right.
pretend. But we all appreciate someone who's gone to school and studied medicine and knows how to treat cancer in someone we love, right? Like, we
Right.
wouldn't just go to an amateur and say, "Oh, you're an authentic person. You decide,
Right.
right?" So where does that line with expertise come into communications? Do we ultimately side with someone who may sound a little bit more thoughtful or distinguished or articulate or verbose even,
Mm-hmm.
versus the person who repeats a lot of one syllable words and maybe says some things that aren't true?
Mm-hmm.
But it's all in the interest of authenticity. And I don't have an answer there. Like, and I'd
Mm-hmm.
love to hear your perspective here too. But I feel like this is sort of a philosophy, a point of view that is being fought over right now in the media. Like, who's authentic, who's trustworthy. And right now, the people that sound a little too articulate, a little too practiced, are held in higher suspicion as being somehow obfuscating, or
Yeah.
they are too clever, or they are hiding the truth. Whereas if they could just say the truth off the top of their head, they wouldn't have to hide anything. But you and I know that it's very rare in life that there's a choice between pure right and pure wrong. In many
Hmm.
cases, it's a choice between terrible and even worse. And so how do
Yeah.
you communicate complicated things to people while still earning their trust and sustaining hope and all those good, important things?
Mm. That's awesome. It makes me think of this newsletter I read this morning. It's The Communication Equation by Doug Taylor. And he actually lives like 5 minutes away from me. It's the craziest thing. We connected on
Cool.
LinkedIn and we grabbed coffee. But he was talking about how effective communication is a funny phrase. It's like, well, how do you know when communication is effective? And he made this reference to people who run races. And I did cross country and track in high school. And one of the craziest feelings is whenever you're lining up and they're like, on your mark, set, and your stomach and your nerves are through the roof, right? And then go. But he said those racers have thousands of thoughts going through their head. But one of the thoughts that they don't have in their head is, well, where am I going? Right? Because they know where they're going. They're just going to run the track. And he said communication needs to be the same way. So whenever you show up to a place, you need to have an idea of a finish line in your head. And the finish line, he said, needs to be somewhat vague because, like, for instance, if I'm giving a talk and I want to get more clients for my business, then like it needs to be specific, but also vague, because he says, you're right. There isn't like, oh, it worked or it didn't. It's like in persuasion, you don't move a person from a 0 to a 9. More than likely, you move them from like a 4.5 to a 4.7. And then the
Right.
next person moves them to a 4.9. And then maybe they experience something that they didn't even talk to anybody and they get moved to a 5.1. So then you check in with them a couple years later and they're at a 7. And you're like, whoa. So he said, whenever you know the finish line, then you can build out to that. And then you can figure out what exactly effective communication looks like. So I think with the practice and with being natural, a big thing is to practice things like that, like practice coming up with, okay, well, what's the goal here? And we all have different goals. I'm reading this book called The Purpose of Gathering, and it's all about like how we can make the most of bringing people together in our lives. And the author named Priya Parker, she said, every gathering needs to have a purpose. So a wedding could either honor the newlyweds or the wedding could honor the parents. And
That's powerful.
yeah. And if the wedding's honoring the parents, the guest list is going to be much different than honoring the newlyweds. And
Yeah.
the structure of the night is going to be different. And whether or not they do a baby shower at the hometown versus where they currently live, So finding that finish line is fascinating for any time you're like about to talk or any conversation you're about to have. I don't imagine me being like, okay, well, what's the finish line here? What's the finish line there? But it is something
Yeah.
interesting to think about.
I feel like I always build a framework for access ideas where I know what I know for sure is I want a guest to have a chance to talk about at least 3 different things.
Mm.
And I've always worked that out in advance with them. Usually it's fairly obvious because it's their subject matter expertise. But my hope is that it will ultimately be an opportunity to connect and exchange and maybe find some really cool examples that we hadn't thought of, or explore ways that this idea or their ideas could intersect with really common ideas or common experiences, more likely, that most listeners might already be having. And so that, in that sense, I do kind of like to keep it open-ended, because I don't want it to feel too scripted. I
Mhm.
don't want it to feel like we have an agenda, hit your points, bye-bye. And that's partly why I like the long form podcast,
Yeah.
because I feel like so many TV and radio interviews are just starting to get interesting, and then it's
Right.
cut. Now, that being said, maybe I have more time than the average person to listen to all this stuff. And my brother was asking me the other day, like, how do you find the time to listen to all these conversations? And it just so happens I do have a lot of time to listen to these things. And I pretty much always am listening to something, but it has a positive influence in the sense that I'm sometimes able to make connections between two totally different ideas or even subject matter and then see something in common. So, what is the relationship between political activism and people who identify as victims and victim psychology?
Mm.
Like I start to notice patterns, and that's really interesting. Now, I'm not a qualified, certified psychologist, but I like making sense of the world. And when I can see those strands coming together, I think, something here is making sense.
Yeah. Would you say listening to Sam Harris has made you a better person?
I would say so. And partly also because I use the Waking Up app,
Mhm.
and that is a meditation app, but it also includes perspectives from different spiritual teachers, from different philosophers. So there's a whole series on stoicism, and it's trained me or helped me practice becoming more aware of emotions as they arise.
Mm.
And I think as a communications person, so often we get hijacked by emotions as human beings, but as a communications person, we need to be ultra aware of that.
Mhm.
So, is my sudden impatience because I think I forgot to turn the stove off and now I'm going to cut somebody off in conversation because I need to run and check,
Mm.
you know? And sometimes it's as simple as that, but I don't know if you ever notice that you'll be perturbed or just distracted by something. And then that experience has a certain resonance that carries on into the next 5 to 10 minutes or even longer.
Yeah.
And you find yourself looking at a page of script or content and thinking, I haven't absorbed any of this because I'm not able to focus. Well, why is that? Oh, it's because so and so said this, and I don't understand what they meant. And that was another conversation. So I think if anyone's interested in mindfulness meditation, being able to pay attention
Mhm.
to your thought patterns, to your, how does your physical experience match your mood? It's an absolute phenomenal tool. And in that alone, and then of course his ideas about the world,
Mhm.
everything from geopolitics to quantum physics. I mean, I don't understand all of it,
Yeah.
but he makes it more accessible than most people can.
Right.
So I love that. How about you?
I would agree. I think he's brilliant. I think there are a lot of great thinkers out there that we have access to, and it's encouraging for me to hear you say, "Yeah, he has improved my life," because it is a testament to how if we do it well and we actually pour our life into it, we could improve people and like create higher integrity for people and create higher quality of living that they get to experience. It's wild watching people like Sam or others create everything they do.
And that's my hope really, is that if anyone listens to me or access ideas and it helps them brighten their day or it gives them a new idea for the way they look at their relationships or their mental and emotional fitness or their ability to get things done,
Hmm.
then I kind of feel like part of my mission here in life is accomplished. I might never know that. I might never find out that I did that, but I'm okay. I mean, it would be nice to know. I think maybe that's part of the challenge of being a podcaster is unless you've built up a big community, you don't always know.
Right.
And I've tried to get better at reaching out to podcasters that I like and leaving comments and saying, hey, this really
Right.
changed my mind. Or, your newsletter in particular is written so well. And every time I see it, I almost always read it right away because it's just like a little nugget of wisdom that will kind of like, oh yeah, that thing that I forgot. And so often it's not like we don't need profound insights that we've never heard, but we're so bombarded with information that we need to be reminded regularly of what matters. Does that make sense to you in the sense like so often when something really resonates with us. So the pastor you were mentioning with a beautiful voice, maybe most of what he said wasn't new. You'd heard it before, but it was, wow, he's put it together in this way that just goes right to my heart.
I think that's one of the biggest secrets to impacting people is most often people just need reminders. And that's why I think that Atomic Habits as a book has been on New York Times bestseller for years. It's a collection of things we know, but we're reminded and we're reminded and reminded. Learning that lately has helped remove a lot of pressure off me, especially whenever I'm creating things, because I get to tell myself, this may seem small to me, but it could be big for somebody else. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And if it isn't, if it is small to somebody else, then maybe I can stroke someone's ego and they could be like, this expert.
I figured this out.
Right. Like, you really, this is it. Like, it's like, okay, cool. And building off from there. But one of the things I was going to say earlier, and I just realized it whenever I was talking about the finish line, one of my, the biggest moments I had regarding public speaking was I got to be a public speaking teacher for a couple years. And
wow, what was that like?
It was one of the biggest things was we had rubrics. Okay. And the rubrics looked at the nonverbals in the presentation and how many words were on the presentation versus images. But then they looked at how the person actually communicated nonverbally and how they're standing, and then the ums and the verbal fillers, and did they hit their main points? But at the beginning of the week, we would set the target and we'd say, okay, your goal is to create a persuasive speech. You can pick the topic. We'll work with you to create the speech, and then you have to deliver it. So we set that target, and then we went in and we created a big presentation for them to give. And then whenever they gave it, having a rubric really changed things, because before having a rubric, I would listen to someone and they'd be really good at they could just show up and start talking. But then I'd look and oh, wait, they actually didn't cover any of the content. So I would have given them an A. Wow. Because they were so confident and they were smiling and looking at the people. But now that I have this rubric, I can actually see that what you created or what you just did there was you talked, and unfortunately it was a C performance. I'm like, what? And then it changed things. Now, I think outside of the classroom, it's not that egalitarian. I think that even people who don't know what they're saying, if they can do it well, they can really get places. But that really stood out to me. So whenever you can combine that idea with the idea of just being reminded about things is really big. Both those things makes it all seem a bit more accessible.
It does. And I think you need to remember to practice too, because so often most of us fall into the habit of once we learn something, you're like, that's it. I got it done. It's on the checklist. I never have to think about it again because I know the thing.
Right.
But that's why one of my favorite expressions is, here, take my advice. I'm not using it.
Oh, wow.
We are so good at disembodying or losing the connection with the learning. And that's why, I think a rubric, like you mentioned, is so helpful, because maybe we pick up on that person's intense confidence and they're entertaining enough that you could say, hey, they've got my attention. Right. I'm feeling like I'm following them. But we have to go back to the essentials and say, but what's the substance here? What's the actual message? What do they have to defend their points? And it's like, I think a lot of things in communication are like that, where I even caught myself the other day complaining about something, and I thought, oh, I'm now the person that I complain about, which is complaining about complaining. And I kind of laughed it off, and I said, oh, see, now I'm turning into the person I'm complaining about. But
Did you say him by name?
it was just the whole concept of complaining in general. And I was just like, I don't know how to handle it sometimes. But it was humbling because it's like, oh, yes, I really need to remember to actually take my advice. And hey, I think I'm going to have to do that forever, because communication seems like the muscle that atrophies fastest. You get someone who, I don't know if you've ever had an experience where maybe you had a really bad flu or a cold, and maybe you didn't talk to anyone for a few days, and then you went to have a conversation, and apart from your voice sounding kind of creaky and not so great, maybe you also felt really slow, and you thought, where's my mind? I can't draw on what I was expecting to, or I can't pull these things out of my head like I'm used to. And we see that, of course, with people who isolated themselves a lot during the pandemic, is that they lost these really vital connections. And in a way, that's why I love the message that you give, Chris. It's about talking to strangers. It's about just finding every opportunity to strengthen that muscle. And it might feel like a small thing to say, go up to a stranger and ask a closed-ended question.
Right.
But ultimately, we are richer for it, because that is our wealth, right? It's our ability to connect with others. And yeah, but I think still going back to the idea of practicing what we preach, it's remaining aware, remaining humble, and having the wisdom to come back and like keep coming back to the table, even if you have to go back to that lesson 100 times and say, I am not someone who wants to complain all the time. I'm going to practice that today. So what do you think? What's your Achilles heel or lesson that you keep learning? And if you're not comfortable sharing, that's okay. But I'm super curious about, what are the lessons that we have to keep learning as people? So what do you notice that you keep coming back to, if you're comfortable sharing?
One thing that I've had to really impart to myself countless times is, I think it stems from the whole idea of I am enough, but one lane specifically is that I can financially create resources, because I think I saw people struggle a lot whenever I was growing up, and it almost created a mindset to myself that was like, this is going to be hard. And I got good at it being hard. And then I find myself being like introduced or being around or hearing from people who approach finances way different than me. And I begin to recognize, like, oh, you could make that much money, or, well, you could do a project and charge that much, or what if the way that you've been viewing money is not like real, or like not
as accurate as it, you can find another way to view money.
Yeah, you can find another way to view money. But I'm always like, I'll have a big win. Like maybe I get this contract. I'm like, wow, could you have imagined that being the case? And it is the case, but then thinking to myself, so I think that's hard. I think another thing I'm always having to remind myself of is, it's okay for me not to know what to say or how to say it. I think being the talk to people guy and being the communications guy and being like all of this, like I'll have self-identity, and sometimes if I just fumble, it's like a identity quake, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Chris. And Annie hears most of it, but it's like, oh yeah, this went south, this went south. But it's fascinating, Yana, because a lot of my nightmares are relational stuff. I don't more often than not, it's not like me getting chased by a gunman or a saber-toothed tiger at my neck, or like me being in a bad car wreck, like a disaster. It's like, oh no, I let someone down, or oh no, I
Oh,
broke someone's trust. And that elicits the most reaction from me. So it's so interesting how, like, even in the subconscious, like interpersonal dynamics are present there.
well, it says something about your integrity and that
Yeah.
like you're so committed to living that value,
Hmm.
and the thought of losing that even temporarily feels threatening.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
about you?
Yeah. I can definitely relate to that. I think also going back to what Sam Harris teaches, like not taking things personally
Hmm.
has been really liberating. I had a very funny encounter in yoga class the other day, and I've told this story a few times. So if you know me, you've heard it, but it was so baffling. It was really cold here. I live in Ottawa in Canada, and it was well below freezing. And I had done a really intense workout the day before, and I was super sore. And I don't usually go to yoga, but the hot yoga studio was looking like a great place to get some stretches in. And I went to the instructor and I said, look, I'm in a lot of pain. I don't really have it in me to do the full yoga class today. So you're going to see me doing some really basic stretches. It's not a comment on your value as a teacher. I just kind of, I need I need to relax.
Yeah.
She said, no problem, no problem. So I kind of tucked myself out of view from the mirror because I went behind like a vestibule so nobody could see me. I didn't want to distract people by like not following the class. But, and I'm not super proud of this, I had my phone out and I was scrolling a little bit. I didn't lift it up. It was just on the floor in front of me. And I was literally right beside the window. So I was at the back of the class. So I
Sure.
didn't think anyone could see me. But the end of the class, a woman walked up to me and said, would you mind not using your phone during this class? I find it very distracting.
Mm.
And my jaw just hit the floor. And I didn't know what to say. I thought it was so funny because it's like, didn't you just say namaste like 60 seconds ago? Like,
Right.
do you know what namaste means? Anyway, I didn't say that. But the more I thought about it, the more hilarious it became until I was laughing to myself. And I thought it was hilarious. But then as I told this story, most people said to me that they would have retorted or reacted with something kind of snappy back.
Hmm.
But I think in the moment it didn't occur to me to take it personally because it was so bizarre.
Right.
And I didn't know what to make of it. And I thought, I feel kind of bad for this person because if she's so bothered by this, I can only imagine what the rest of her life is like. Like she must be really perturbed by
Yes.
many things. But, in the end, she became sort of like this source of comic inspiration. And I just kept laughing about it. And I was like, oh, she probably wouldn't like that. But in the end, I think it's been things like meditation and mindfulness and recognizing when a situation comes up that has nothing to do with you.
Hmm.
It's just one of those bizarre interactions.
I love that moment. I think that's hilarious. I imagine your face whenever she says that to you, like reacting to it, and then
Oh,
thinking of it and talking about it. It's been one thing that's been kind of funny is any type of like internet comment I get on, like on YouTube. If I have a video that's doing well, then oftentimes people will comment, and there have been such wild comments. And it's so one funny thing is I'll tell them to Annie and she'll be like, "Oh, I don't like that," and I'm just laughing, like I'm cracking up. But I think maybe like hearing it for someone else, they're like, "Oh, what the heck?" But like it's just so bizarre to me thinking about a person who's sitting at their computer, and like this one person was like, you don't know what you're talking about. You have to do a YouTube video because you're worthless in real life and all this different stuff.
was
And
this the all caps guy?
um there was a lot of all caps guys, but I forget which one this was, but it's funny because I had to hide so many comments, but
Yeah.
as I was doing it, I was just kind of laughing, imagining what that must be like to like sit there and
think of it.
yeah,
And then write
and
it.
more than
Yeah.
like on a phone, right? Like
Yeah. Take the time.
take your time, and then talk all this stuff. So it made me chuckle, and it got to the point to where I have a friend who he'll like we're kind of like doing YouTube together, and he has different videos, and he'll help me with like inspiration for like a title or a thumbnail, and he has access to my dashboard so he can see like the analytics. And earlier he was like, "Oh, hey, I hit a comment because it was really mean," and I was like,
Ooh.
"Keep it." I said, like, I want to be able to see it and screenshot it, and then I'll hide it, because my take on the comment section is I'm cool with feedback, even if they're like, "Hey, you completely missed the mark, and here's why." I'm cool with that constructive feedback. But if it's just like if it's not constructive, then it's not going to benefit the comment section. And
that's interesting though what you said about thinking about the person taking the time, because I had a nasty comment. I don't have a lot of YouTube videos, but some of my podcasts came out.
yeah.
And one of the only comments that was nasty was, listening to you is like watching paint dry. And I thought, it would have been less suffering for you if you just switched to another video.
Right.
Because taking the time to type this prolongs the suffering. And so it was to that point, like, it does make me imagine who these people are, these commenters, like what it must be like to live in their heads.
Yeah.
Because it seems a bit tortured, to be honest.
It does. And it seems like you are living in someone else's space, right? And it's that same idea of the internal versus external locus of control.
Yes.
It's that idea of external, like, I'm not in control. Like, I have to sit here and watch this guy. It's like Mr. Beast is right there, and
go for it.
Margot Robbie and her award speech, and Ryan Gosling, like, there's so much content here. But there was a funny moment wherever someone had a huge criticism on me, and it was like a personal attack. And then at the end, they said, "I watched the whole thing for your information." So I was like,
just so you're clear.
Yeah. I was imagining like, I got to watch the whole thing before I can hit send. But it is fascinating. And
they wanted to show they were being fair, Chris.
Yeah.
They wanted to
right. And I said, I just hit the user. But sometimes I will just respond to him and say, "Thanks for watching."
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Just be unrelentingly positive.
Unrelentingly positive. And I think I think that's helped me out a ton to learn not to take things personal. But I could understand how, if that were to happen to you every day, like, to me, it's only happened a few times, but if you were really in the limelight and that stuff happens to you every day on multiple fronts, I could understand how, even if it's not theoretically personal, it's just like the person's having a hard day, or they just don't really know how to construct their emotions well enough to communicate positively. I could understand how it can wear people down.
For sure. And so whenever I do hear stories about, actually just mentioned Mr. Beast, and I think there was a story about him, quote unquote, like not being nice to somebody. And I thought, I'm pretty sure we're all not nice to somebody at some point within the last month. Take that as you will, but there is this incredible scrutiny held up to influencers and content creators, and you're never really allowed to be off. And maybe that's why I've hesitated going on video, because I know that I'm much more likely to face comments about my appearance, which I don't really like. I don't love the idea of hearing comments about my appearance when I'm not really willing to modify my appearance a whole lot, right?
Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, I've been really inspired by a lot of content creators who are not stereotypical looking. They're not going on camera with a lot of makeup, for example, if they're women, or they're not going on with sort of the coiffed and perfect manicured look of like a newscaster. And so maybe that kind of democratizes the way that comments are delivered. So you're going to still get negative comments, especially if you're successful.
Mm-hmm.
But content is so infinite now that you can kind of take it as like that's just part of the cost of doing business and part of the cost of success. However, to your point, Chris, if it got so bad that I were someone who constantly received negative criticism, I would definitely be looking to my team to take down some of those comments, because it's also disheartening for the audience to see a lot of that, because most of your audience are there presumably because they like your content.
Right.
Otherwise, they wouldn't take the time, because most of us take the time to comment when we like something, not when we hate it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just seeing those kinds of comments, like sometimes I call it a block party, where you show up in a comment section and you're like, okay, I'm just going to block some of these because I don't need this. I don't need to see your other comments wherever you have gone and done your thing. I don't want to see it.
And it costs so little. There's this feature on YouTube called hide user from channel. Have you seen it?
I have not.
Okay. So what happens is you can go to their comment and you can click hide user from channel. It will hide that comment from everybody else, but to them, it's still up. Yeah.
Interesting.
So what some people will do is they'll be like, oh, you deleted my comment, coward, or, you're hiding the truth or something like that. You can't take criticism or you can't take feedback. But whenever you do hide user from channel, from then on out, on every single video on your channel, their comments are never visible to anybody else
anyone except them.
But them. So
amazing.
They are screaming into the void.
Well, they can't say that you blocked them or that you didn't let them have their say. It's there for them to see. So I like it.
Like they can still do everything they can do. What's your take on the paparazzi?
That's been so fascinating to see during my lifetime because, of course, National Enquirer and celebrity regs were just a staple when I was growing up. Mm-hmm. And, you go to the grocery checkout and there'd be whatever, like gossip regs. And people talk about it, but now it's like everyone can be a paparazzo and anybody can take a photo and people are literally seeking it out. So obviously certain celebrities have become famous for arranging, spontaneous sightings. Like I guess it's really great for a type of influencer, I suppose, especially if they're trying to sell products that are material, whether it's accessories or fashion or just style stuff. I am kind of glad that that our world is so niche now, though, that it's probably easy to have a celebrity that many people don't know about, and yet they're intensely popular with their particular audience. And so it would be funny, to go to a place and you see someone being mobbed and you're like, I have no idea who that is.
Right.
Whereas I don't think that could have happened 10 or definitely 20 years ago. It just would not have been possible or pretty rare. What do you think? Do you think it's kind of peaked already, or do you think that it's going to be a bigger problem?
I think that, like whenever you see 40 people take pictures of Justin Bieber when he leaves Taco Bell, and then there's these compilations of Justin Bieber like getting mad with the paparazzi, I am like, yeah, it's the whole idea of the social battery and it constantly being drained. And then you have to show up. Like for most people, we can light up for the camera. Like for me, I have a lot of outtakes whenever I'm recording, but for the most part, I can smile and I can look at the camera and I can have do all my gestures. And yesterday, the YouTube channel had surpassed 1,000 subscribers and I did a live. It was at 998. And I was like, all right, Annie, let's going to do a live. And Annie and I were grilling chicken right before this. and we were like kind of having an argument a little bit. And I remember it being like, okay, like let's do the live. And then the live came out and I'm like laughing and smiling and stuff like that. And we like, we can do that for the most part, like hop on the camera and stuff. But, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of that idea of the paparazzi. I understand like the National Enquirer, like how it came to be, because people just want to know that stuff for some odd reason. But do you think you'd ever want to be famous?
If I had a choice to be rich and famous or just rich, I would always pick rich. I would never pick famous. And if I had to be famous and I didn't have a choice, I would try to convert it to anonymity and become as boring as possible as soon as possible. Because the problem with fame is it's never about you, it's about your fans and people projecting an image. And I think it's like the legacy of the humans, you know, tendency to worship like the Greek gods, and you think about tribal religions, and we want someone to like look up to and idolize. But once you're on that pedestal, the only place to go is fall down.
Right.
Like you're not going anywhere else. So I do not envy people who are celebrities. I think some of them probably manage it to their ultimate advantage. Many of them make some money from it, a lot of money, but a lot of them seem pretty lonely when they're older too. And that kind of undermines to me the whole point, because people often seek out celebrity because they think it means they'll feel loved. But if that person doesn't even have friends by the time, you know, they're no longer young and beautiful, then I don't know, is that really successful? I think that it's not what I would choose for me or people I love.
How would you make yourself as boring as possible quickly?
Oh, talk about accounting, tax law.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to get a niche audience there for sure, but probably not many talking points will reach your headlines, you know. I think if Justin Bieber covered up his tattoos and started talking about tax law on a regular basis and got like an accountant haircut, he could probably gain some anonymity. Not that he should have to, but I just mean if you were desperate. Yeah.
That's hilarious. Yeah. he could almost like lose followers. People would start unsubscribing. I think it's funny thinking about how we create the celebrities and then we kind of enjoy their downfall, which is bad. There's a person who's like is like an acquaintance to me, and they won a Super Bowl. And
oh wow,
I was thinking I saw them in person and I like talked to them for a little bit, but I could just kind of tell that they were a little guarded. And I was like reflecting on that. And I was reflecting on like our interaction, because I didn't feel good about it, because to me, it was like a lose-lose situation in my head. Because it was like either I go up there and say the same thing that everybody else is saying, congrats on the Super Bowl, you know, that's huge. Like before this moment, I had never met anybody who had won a Super Bowl. So it was like, whoa, like in my head, I'm like, well, that's pretty cool, right? But then I had the other side of my head. I was like, oh, just treat him like a person and don't say like congrats on the Super Bowl. But then it's like, but it's obviously congrats, right?
Of course.
And but then it's like whenever I went into the interaction, it seemed like he was a bit guarded and we really didn't. And I can put a high expectation on conversation to like, oh, I want to get substance out. But then it makes sense why he's guarded, right? Because he has.
Yeah. And for someone like that, like he didn't necessarily go in hoping for celebrity. Obviously, if you're a professional athlete, you are at the top of your game, literally, figuratively,
right?
And you want to be successful and maybe build off of that career. But you might not be someone who naturally wants to be a celebrity or famous. And I read or listened to the audiobook, Britney Spears' audiobook. And, you know, to me, it was like a tragedy. It's a tragic story. It's really sad, but I definitely felt a lot of inner tension because I remember all the gossip and the tabloid magazines making so much money off her.
Right.
And when you read about her perspective and her experience, it's all very sad. There's not much to celebrate there. There's not much to say, oh, but you still got XYZ. Like, ultimately, I think that's where celebrity is almost like a double-edged sword because you don't know who to trust anymore. You don't know who you are to people anymore. Like, you're, to your point, not being authentic or feeling that there's this inauthenticity. But maybe he also feels guarded. Like, does Chris want something from me now
Right.
that I'm famous? I don't really see a lot of celebrities who seem very well adjusted or balanced. And I mean, I don't know any. Like, I don't really know any celebrities. But so who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? But when I look at people I admire and I think I would like to be more like this person, I think, Sam Harris, like I mentioned already, but I suppose people like that whose ideas end up making them
Right.
fairly well
Right.
known.
Right.
But I don't really see him living like a celebrity lifestyle and doing flashy things. I could be wrong. I don't know him personally, but I think our particular era is particularly rough on just churning people through the grinder when it comes to success and fame and celebrity. And it's not, like I said, it's not something I would choose for myself. But do you feel an inner conflict? Like, you're obviously out to make a name with your podcast. You're there to make connections with people. You want to spread the word. You want to influence people in the best possible way. But do you worry about this for yourself ever? Like, is that something that makes you feel like it might compromise who you would be?
Yeah, I think I definitely worry. And I agree with what you're saying, how we churn things out quick. We churn people up quick. And if you are at a point to where you've received some level of fame, then you're constantly wondering, especially nowadays, because I'll get Instagram messages saying, okay, this morning I got an email from a person who said, hey, Chris, my PR firm can get you on the New York Times or a different big publication. And it's just like blog, like send to spam. Like, I don't got anything going on really. So it's like, imagine what happens if you actually have something that like universally people view as like a big success icon. Then people are going to start hitting you up off the charts. Like on Instagram, you can have 200 followers and people will comment on there and be like, would love to promote, DM me, you know? And you're like,
I've seen that.
Yeah, it's so easy to discount all that stuff. So I think there is a ton of tension there. It's fascinating to me though, like talking about this, because we could invest all of our time and ability in connecting with people better and how to use questions that evoke emotion and how to acknowledge emotion and how to recognize what our physical setting will contribute to the actual conversation that we're having. But then there are these things that are out of our control almost, like fame. And I guess when you get to that point, just the realization and the acknowledgement that fame changes things. It's like, no matter how good of a communicator, you may not feel the most socially fulfilled after a talk with Tom Cruise because of certain things he has going on. So it's interesting to me, just like you said at the very beginning, how you viewed communication as almost like magic. And if you got really good at it, it could fix things and it could turn things into the way you wanted it to be. But there's so much out there like fame that really changes things no matter how well you communicate.
Yeah. And some people don't get to choose, right? If you are, let's say, born into a royal family or
like Barron
something
Trump.
A famous family. That's a great example. How do you differentiate yourself and take on your own personal identity and decide who you want to be?
Mm-hmm.
I could argue that you never really lose that brand or that legacy attachment. Can you make peace with it? Probably, but there's a lot of children of very successful, famous, wealthy people who just don't end up on the right side of the equation for whatever reason.
Right.
So maybe in a way we're lucky, we don't have that burden. I mean, you could say we're lucky for all different reasons. Maybe we're born in this day and age, or that we have the rights we have in the countries that we live. But fame is in and of itself, I find it strange and baffling that so many people seem to pursue it without any regard to their mental health or awareness. Like they're just utterly convinced that, yes, indeed, this is the answer. And yet all you have to do is look at the latest lineup of celebrity biographies or autobiographies. How many are serial divorces, alcoholism, substance abuse, mental illness, bankruptcy? These are not things that anyone would choose in their right mind, I would think. And yet, is it just a coincidence that they happen to come from people who are celebrities? I don't think so. I think the magnifying glass, the pressure, the intensity of celebrity is deeply unhealthy. And I think it's a rare person that can make it to the other side intact. And so if I had it foisted on me for some strange reason, I feel like I'd have to hire a whole team of people to manage stuff. And then it's like, well, I'm not just going to spontaneously go for a walk down the street because that's no longer open to me. So I don't really understand the desire, but it seems to be relentless now. Like there's more kids than ever that see being an influencer as synonymous with having a great life. And when you see the behind the scenes stuff, nothing could be further from the truth. And so I think it's key to really set boundaries early on and decide how much of your life you're willing to share. I think authenticity definitely lends itself to providing better content like you do, Chris, like you're honest about who you are. But then you see the families on YouTube that show their kids every move, and you find out some really disturbing stuff about what's been happening. So I think it's better to set the boundaries early and decide, what are you willing and what will you not? Because if you don't set a line, if you don't set a boundary, you can quickly compromise and you can end up in a place that you never imagined and not for the better.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question that I ask the majority of people who come on here to finish up. And it's funny to follow what you just said with this question. And that's, what's something you wish more people knew about you?
I wish more people knew that I'm pretty silly most of the time. And I make a lot of immature jokes, and I spend most of my time trying to make my husband laugh about really stupid stuff. And I try to bring out some of that, but I feel like part of me is so serious on my podcast. And I'd like to share that more. And maybe I will. Maybe I will when I'm like more seasoned, whatever that means.
You should challenge yourself to have like 4 silly moments in your next episode.
Yeah. I think I should.
Yeah, because silly is fun. Everybody loves silly. So speaking of your podcast, we have a couple of cool projects you're working on, and tell all of our happy guests from this conversation where they can keep up with you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Well, you can follow me on social media sites like LinkedIn and Facebook primarily. And the podcast is on all the major platforms.
When are you going to start writing a newsletter?
That's a good question. I think I hesitate to do that because I do that sort of thing for my day-to-day job.
Okay.
I think as the AI tools are getting better, it becomes more possible, but I can't make any promises. But your newsletter, Chris, I will keep reading. So please keep publishing. Even if you can't do it on the regular, please just keep publishing.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah. Well, thank you for being here, Yana. It's been so cool to be able to get to know you, and I'm excited for us to continue to geek out on all of this stuff. It was such a blast being on your podcast, and it's been cool being able to see, like, despite us being thousands of miles away, we're still working on similar things.
Absolutely. And that's the power of podcasting.
It unites the Americas.
That's right. The English-speaking world, if you will.
Yeah, the English-speaking world. Okay, well, with that being said, as always, we will see you next time, folks.
Thanks, Chris. Bye. If you love Access Ideas, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and review us on Podchaser via the link in our show notes, or wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. Tell your friends about the podcast too. Until next time, thanks for listening to Access Ideas.